All right, guys, so let's talk about Diablo 4. I want to give you guys my honest thoughts and an honest review of the game. I've hit level 100. I've put in hundreds of hours already. I have experienced everything that this game has to offer. So I'm going to be going over quite a few points here in this video, but I don't want this to be super ranty. So we're just going to be firing through things, starting with the game at its base. This is a game that focuses on the adventure from level 1 to 100. You have something called nightmare dungeons that are accessible to you at level 50. You use them primarily to level up your glyphs, which is an aspect of the game that gives you power, and it is the only thing in the game that is available to you past level 100 that becomes increasingly difficult. The other thing that is available after level 100 is the pinnacle boss encounter, which is called the Echo of Lilith. That is a final boss encounter that is also level 100 that you can look forward to when reaching the end game. Outside of that, the only progression that you have past level 100 is indeed the nightmare dungeons. When you hit tier 46, the mobs are level 100, and as you go up the tiers, the mobs are higher level, become increasingly difficult, with a cap being at tier 100. The next thing that you have is your world completion or renown. This is what people would consider to be the horizontal content in this game. This is also tied to your power as you get skill points and things like that you have to do. World completion, renown, one and the same. The other thing that you have are the seasons. This game is a season-based game. You can expect 4 seasons a year, and these seasons are a hard reset every season. So essentially, you have a game that focuses from level 1 to 100, which gets reset every 4 months quarterly. What you have once you hit level 100 is the pinnacle boss encounter and pushing as high as you can in the nightmare dungeons. With everything else, world bosses, hell tides, all that other stuff that you hear about, all that stuff is for the purpose of increasing your power, which is for the purpose of pushing higher nightmare dungeons. To go over the pros for Diablo 4, I would start by saying that the campaign is fantastic. Most people will tell you that it is nothing short of stellar. Some people will say it's mid, but no one's going to tell you that it's actually bad. The dev team running Diablo 4 has also been a highlight. They are very vocal. Their communication with the community is fantastic, and they're quick to make changes. The other thing that I would say is that Diablo 4 is, in my opinion, the most AAA polished ARPG. And I'm not talking about bugs. I'm just talking about visually, the world, the character, just the polish would be the best word to use. The other pro I would say is the open world. I think they knocked it out of the park with the open world. Conceptually, I would say it is a huge success. It's a great change of pace, and it is certainly a little bit more immersive, especially with the multiplayer aspect of it. The combat is also a massive pro. Not only does it feel impactful, but it is a good balance between more of a methodical approach versus the typical ARPG spam fest. It's kind of right in between. They do a good job balancing both. It certainly gets spammier at the end game, level 100, once your build is all put together, but it's never to the extent of just flashing lights and you don't know what's actually happening. The drop rates are another thing that makes the pros list for me. It was difficult to gauge the drop rate experience from the beta test, but in the live version of the game, the higher you go, the higher level you become, the higher world tier that you unlock, the better the drop rates seem to be. At level 100, it is extremely easy to farm legendaries. They drop left and right, always dropping. And it's actually pretty easy to farm uniques as well. Uniques aren't going to drop every run, but they do drop on occasion to the point where you can be hopeful to build around a specific unique, unless it is a super unique, which isn't really a classification title in the game, but I would consider certain items to be super uniques, like the Harlequin helmet, which is widely known as the Shako. That is a super rare item that not many people get. The end game pinnacle boss fight that you'll experience at level 100 is the last thing that I will add to my list of pros. This is an extremely challenging fight that you'll get to experience at the end game, and it will require you to not only build your character in a specific way and gear up, but it will also require you to master the patterns and learn the mechanics of the fight. I'm really hoping that they make more of this type of content moving on, because this was just a major highlight in the end game, in my personal opinion. The next section I want to go over is the progression aspect of Diablo 4. Now, we're going to start with the leveling portion. Like I said, this game revolves around the journey from level 1 to 100. Overall, I feel the pacing to that is fairly slow. It certainly doesn't match a 1.5 to 2 month period from the launch of the game to season 1. Now, you could look at this as preseason, and it doesn't really matter because you do have 3 or 4 months between each season, probably about 3 months since it's quarterly, and that seems to make sense with the pacing of the leveling to 100, because remember, level 100, the journey to, is the main focus of the game. So I guess that would probably line up pretty well there, but it doesn't change the fact that getting from 1 to 100 does feel like a grind. It is the opposite of Diablo 3, where you just instantly get to end game and you're pushing through. In regards to the pacing, when it comes to season 1 releasing, I feel like season 1 is releasing a little bit too early. What's going to end up happening is that the majority of the players aren't going to actually get to level 100, and the season 1 is going to come out and they're just going to have to do everything all over again, and that to me isn't going to be the best experience for the player, especially because they never got to hit level 100. So not sure what the decision is here to release season 1 so fast, but it certainly doesn't match up with the pacing to level 100. Leveling gets extremely slow once you start reaching the higher levels. Start slowing down at 70, you start feeling it a little bit, and you really feel it at level 90. It was around 22 million experience to get from level 99 to level 100, and that increment increased by about 1 million to 2 million experience every level, somewhere in that ballpark. So it is a big grind to level 100. Take that as you will, whether you see that as a good thing or a bad thing, but I think it definitely matches up to a 3-month campaign, not so much a 1.5 month to 2 month campaign between now and season 1. With that said, the leveling being the main focus of the game, or the emphasis of the progression in Diablo 4, I think they need to do something with what you can actually do to level. When it comes to the leveling content of the game, the best way to currently level is by dungeon grind, regardless of what world tier you're in. When you hit world tier 4 and you're starting to push to 100, a Champion's Demise group is hands down the best. What is that? Champion's Demise is a dungeon in Diablo 4 where you split farm. I'm not going to go super into detail, just know that it is a dungeon that you want to enter with a party, and it is hands down the fastest, most efficient way to get to level 100. It's not even close. I am going to be going over some of the cons and some of the critiques that I have, but specifically in regards to this experience is not the best experience, because, well, it's just very grindy and you're doing the same thing over and over again. It's extremely monotonous, and the fact that this is currently the best way to get to level 100, I think that's a problem. Sure, you can say, well, you don't have to do that to get to a level 100, but I would counter that by saying, well, if the emphasis on this game is the journey from level 1 to 100, you are kind of forcing but not forcing people into using this method, because it is a grind to level 100. And believe me, the journey to 100, grinding Champion's Demise, which is the most efficient way of grinding, even that is slow. So it's even slower if you do something else. I think this is a little bit of an issue, not a little bit, I think this is a very big issue with the game. Now, the other issue that I have with the game, specifically to the leveling, is the group versus solo. There is a huge difference between how fast you can progress between partying in a group versus going in solo. The other thing that I want to go over as far as the leveling goes is the nightmare dungeons. The nightmare dungeons are in this game for the purpose of post level 100 content. Number one. Number two, not in any specific order. Number two, to level up your glyphs. So this is something that you will have to do before you even reach level 100. Of course, you can hit 100 and focus on this, but you have to do your nightmare dungeons to level up your glyphs, which is a massive source of power. Now, nightmare dungeons probably are the highlight of the game. It is what's going to keep you in the game even past level 100. It's extremely fun whether you're doing it solo or in a group. However, the experience differential between nightmare dungeons, the Champion's Demise grind, it's so great where it would take you an extremely long period of time to actually reach level 100 by strictly doing your nightmare dungeons. The other thing that I would like to go over is the renown farming. When it comes to progression, farming your renown is also very important. This is your world completion. If you've played Guild Wars 2, it's like completing your entire map. If you've played Lost Ark, it's like completing your adventure tome, your adventure logs. Forget about altars. I think this is going to be extremely painful for a lot of players because this is something that, sure, it is pretty fun or can be fun at first. No one's really complaining about doing it for the first time. Having to do this 4 times a year is going to be extremely painful for a lot of players, and I will bet a lot of money that 90% of the population is not going to be looking forward to refarming their renown, refarming the map completion. Altars of Lilith is something that you get within, or something that you have to farm within this whole map completion, world completion, renown thing. But that's not a big issue because once you unlock the altars, you will always have those stat points from the altars unlocked. If you don't know what I'm talking about, just think of it as a thing that you unlock for map completion, but that's permanently unlocked even in the future. Everything else you have to refarm every season, not to mention the repetitive grind of Champion's Demise to level 100. We'll talk more about this later on. The other thing that I want to go over is the itemization with Diablo 4. I think the base system conceptually, it's pretty great. It's pretty simple, but not too simple. There is some complexities to it. The amount of options for the start of the game, I think, is great. I think it's totally fine. But in the future, I think there definitely needs to be more legendaries and more uniques that are added, because we are already reaching the point where there are pretty set builds for each class that just are highlighted. Sure, there are a lot of builds that you can play and have fun with, but if you really start messing around with different builds, you're going to start feeling the limitations based off of the actual availability of the uniques and legendaries that are available. More on the itemization, there are certain aspects that I feel like are not super great. Vulnerable having extreme value versus non-multiplicatives. There are damage buckets, and vulnerable is hands down the most, well, one of the most important stats that you want to stack because it is multiplicative to everything else. The implication to vulnerable having this much value is more towards the potential limitations with build diversity, because your build has to have it. If it doesn't, then you're at a handicap versus other builds. For example, Bone Spear, for example, Flurry, that have built-in vulnerable applications. You are already at an advantage compared to some of the other options that you have. Now, of course, you can pick up vulnerable through different aspects, but that's precisely my point. If you have vulnerable that is available built into the skill, then those are potential aspects that you don't have to invest in, because one aspect, it can be a significant amount of power. The other thing is resistances being a meme. Once you start reaching the end game, you're going to notice that damage isn't as big of an issue. The defense values are, and right now resistances have a big issue. I don't think that they have coded it correctly. Right now, everything just seems to be about armor. The next section we're going to go over is the combat and builds. Starting with the combat, in the early game, resource is everything. That is your experience. You're going to be resource starved on almost every single class. But then as you get to the end game, resource becomes less of a problem, and crowd control, or CC, is everything. Past Nightmare tier 50, you face level 100 plus mobs. The higher you get up, the more likely you are to get one shot, because the mobs just continue to increase in level while you don't. Outside of the pinnacle boss, the majority of the content when it comes to the combat is the challenge versus regular mobs. Challenging these mobs is the actual endgame content. The non-CCable mobs, or the boss encounters that you face, again, outside of the pinnacle boss, it really isn't a challenge. It's the easiest part of the game. Getting through the nightmare dungeons with a ton of these mobs that hit you really hard, that is the challenge of the end game when it comes to the actual combat. When it comes to the builds, the best builds in this game at the end game revolve around crowd control, cooldown reduction, and resource maintenance. It has to have vulnerable and crit built into the build, and if you knock all of those things out, then you have a viable build. If you don't have at least one of those things, it will be very difficult. You need to have your vulnerable, and you need to have crit. Now, of course, every build is a little bit different. Some builds you don't need cooldown reduction because you already have low cooldowns, so take that as you will. Druids and barbs stand out in particular at the end game because not only do they mark all the checks for what I just mentioned, but they also have increased survivability while maintaining all of those previous aspects. Now, I want to talk about the other issues that are in this game. Now, each of these points that I'm about to go over could probably have its own segment, but we're not going to be spending too much time. I'm just going to give you the general context here. The first major issue, I would say, is the level scaling. This is something that I want to give a shout out to Crip, because I feel like he might have been the first person to recognize this issue during the beta test. And this is an issue that you will absolutely feel if you are grinding efficiently. Efficiently meaning Champion's Demise. If you're grinding inefficiently to 100, which again, level 100, the Journey 2 is the main emphasis of the game, then you won't feel this issue as much because you will be leveling up your glyphs, but you'll still feel it. What ends up happening is these monsters get stronger when you level up, but if your gear doesn't level up with your level, you are essentially getting weaker by leveling up. That's what's happening, and you feel this especially at level 90. So when I would put together these Champion's Demise parties, I would actually try to refrain from taking higher level characters, because if they were higher levels, like around 90 plus, if they didn't have glyphs and they're grinding levels, they were going to be really weak. That was essentially everyone at level 90 plus, because if you're level 90 plus at that point in the game, you're probably not grinding your glyphs, because I got there relatively early. So I ended up prioritizing people that were like level 70, level 80 to join my party, because they were going to clear faster. The only exception to this rule were barbs, because barbarians were clearing super fast. It was ridiculous. When it comes to the scaling, I think that is a major issue with the game, and they need to address that some way, somehow. Maybe you increase the rates of the nightmare dungeons when it comes to experience, so players are incentivized to level up via nightmare dungeons rather than just grinding the same dungeon over and over again like Champion's Demise. That would also give them the power through the glyphs and the Paragon board that they otherwise wouldn't get by just spam leveling an actual dungeon. That to me makes sense. That to me also would make the journey to level 100 significantly better. The other issue that I have, and this is kind of a double-edged sword, is the balancing. In Diablo 3, they would not change the meta during the season. Right now, we've had so many balance changes just within the first week that you've had builds buried and you've had builds come up. Mainly buried though. It seems like Blizzard prefers to just nerf everything for the builds, or for anything that's performing at another level. Now, of course, there are some things that should absolutely be nerfed, like certain mechanics with Whirlwind and Gores. Those things for sure. But it seems like every class in every aspect is just constantly getting nerfed, and nerfs indirectly buff other things. But the issue that I'm having with this balancing is that it's pretty drastic and they're coming in extremely fast. The vast majority of players have not even hit level 100. For them to build towards a certain spec that max roll, that mobalytics, that content creators are pushing out and promoting on YouTube, those builds are like non-existent within a week sometimes, so like in days so far. And that experience can be very frustrating to players because they're literally investing in a route and then they have to change midway and then do it all over again. I think that is also an issue that should be addressed. Now, I don't know what the fix here is because on one hand, it is good that they're balancing things that are overly powerful, keeping the game in check, really emphasizing the point that they don't want a single meta, a single build to rule them all. I think that's fantastic. But for the people that are pushing towards a certain build, it doesn't feel great when that build becomes non-existent 3 days later. The other issue that I'm having, and this is a universal issue, is the inventory and storage space plus gem stacking. Gem stacking goes without saying. You have so many slots in your bag that are going towards gems and even elixirs and even aspects. And as you get to the end game, we're not just talking about the gems at that point, we're talking about just everything. For a game that is encouraging you to make multiple characters, there simply is not enough storage space and inventory space in the game. You have uniques, you have gear pieces that you want to keep, of course, but then you also have these sigils, you also have these elixirs, you also have these gems, all these things that just really take up a lot of space, and they really need to address this. I have a feeling, sneaky feeling, that they're going to choose to monetize this, but who knows whether they monetize it or not. Please add it into the game sooner than later. The last thing I will say that is a major concern is in relation to hardcore. The hardcore journey is currently extremely frustrating because of the disconnect issue. I have no idea how they address this, but I'm just bringing it up because if you're playing hardcore and you reach level 90 plus, whatever level that you're at, and you die because of a disconnect, that just feels really, really bad. This is something that I feel like they have to address, but I don't know how they could possibly address it. Disconnect is a disconnect at the end of the day. Hopefully they do something because believe me, if you're like level 95, that is a grind and a half. You get to that point and you die in hardcore, man, that's going to feel terrible. And that pretty much covers everything in this video I want to go over. I hope that wasn't too long for you guys. It did go a little bit longer than I was expecting. I hope this was insightful. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. Be sure to come hang out with me on Twitch. I would love to get to know you guys personally there, and I will see you in the next video.